By the way, it is important, before I go back into mercenary armies, city-states, and all the rest of that, it is important to bring up that when I was on with James Church, who was bringing up this whole thing about you need the military to defend freedom of speech and all that stuff, and I countered him, of course, with the absurdity of his argument in that America is surrounded by two oceans on its eastern and western seaboards, the Atlantic and the Pacific, obviously, and it is very difficult to run a massive logistical invasion of a continent across those oceans. In the north, of course, it's got the polar ice cap. Even if that disappears, it's bordered in the north by Canada and an enormous amount of tundra and empty space. It is very difficult to get to the continental United States. The closest nation that can get to us would be Canada, whose population is at this point in history infinitesimal compared to ours. The other nation south of us would be Mexico, which is not capable of mounting a military invasion for a national takeover of the United States. We are experiencing what some might argue is an invasion of the United States from Mexico, but it is decidedly more along the dynamics of a mass migration. And that mass migration has indeed slowed down compared to what it was before because of our economic decline. So if economics really makes an environment more attractive towards incoming peoples, then our decline in economy acts, in a sense, as a national defense. We are no longer worth migrating to. We are not necessarily worth invading. Beyond that, I pointed out to him the inability of other nation states to invade the United States when their own populations have imploded. I've mentioned this multiple times before, that the former Soviet Union, today's Russian Commonwealth of Independent States, has a population which, for all intents and purposes, is flirting with extinction. They are indeed trying to recruit new influx of genetics from Germany, asking people to resettle into Russia, offering payment and land, because they need people who are able to breed and help re-strengthen Russian numbers or even keep up to pace with their decline in population. They have no ability to militarily strike outside of their immediate borders. And as for China, due to its draconian one-child policy, it has been so enforced with such maniacal precision that people were, of course, taking their pregnant wives to get a sonogram. If it was a girl, they would abort it to get a son. They now have headed towards a 75% male population and total implosion in their population. They are already feeling the effects of this in a catastrophic manner. To put this into perspective for you, I've said this before, in the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was president, 1 out of every 4 people on Earth was Chinese. China was 25% of the world's population. And when Deng Xiaoping came into office, became a capitalist roader, started the one-child policy, we are at the point now where just the nations bordering China, not nations far away like the United States or Germany or any European or South American nation, but just the immediate bordering nations of China, Japan, Vietnam, Mongolia, India, Russia, etc., if all of those nations together, just bordering China, got together and attacked, they would outnumber the Chinese population 2-1. Now that's an apocalyptic collapse of Chinese demographics. They are totally incapable of mounting an invasion to come to the United States and overtake your wretched North American continent. So you have no extraneous international threats. If somebody really wanted to come in here and take out the United States with electromagnetic pulsation, you have no idea how easy it could be. And the fact that no one does that is because everyone's dependent on the economic continuity of America's marketplace at the moment. And so long as that is maintained at a semi-functional level, there is no point in rocking the boat of our tiny planet while we're all on it. Now, in terms of the United States, as it accommodates to the reality of people waking up to this, they're going to say, why do we need a military when all it does is it goes overseas to places like Al-Surya Akbar, the Greater Syria, bombs people, creates more enemies we never had before, creates people who really do want to come over here and electromagnetic pulse us, destroy our gas lines, our pipelines, and our energy, shall I say, distribution systems, and throw us back into the dark age. You know, all of this, it's all based on enemies created by the United States itself. So who does this? Well, the enemy makers are your military. So get rid of the military. Your primary means of national defense is your right to bear arms. And one of the things I pointed out, again, to James Church was any invading army that came into the United States would be confronted with the reality of armed people behind every blade of grass. They would be confronted with the reality of armed gangs, paramilitarily oriented and disciplined along the lines of a militia force that are confronting them with AK-47s and rocket launchers. And they are armed at the level of essentially that most militias would envy. There are very few militias that are armed with the modern equipment that an urban gang has. Now, of course, in the tweets, all the tweets that were coming through while I was on with James Church that were being fed to me through my 3D graphics modeler on my screen, I could see all of these subgrade morons saying, that Douglas Dietrich, what an a-hole, wants to deconstruct our military and give our cities over to drug gangs. I was thinking, how retarded must you be to not realize that your cities already belong to your drug gangs? If you don't realize that, you're an idiot. Your economy in places like Detroit or Chicago or many of these areas is drug gangs. Without the drug gangs, there would be no economy in those places. They have no industry. It's the same way with Florida, Miami, so many other places. Drugs is an enormous part of your economy. The dealers have their own private armies. They protect their territory. They protect their turfs. They'd be as aggressive about doing so against a foreign army as they would against you or any police forces. So your primary defense is what you've got standing, and if you reorganize it, so you bring home the mercenaries to defend your city-states, you have a series of essentially impregnable city-states which an enemy would have to take. And because what they've got to deal with now is basically non-existent, then you need to confront the fact that your military, for all intents and purposes, serves no function whatsoever other than to make enemies that want to hurt you. I'll put this into perspective again. The Soviet Union, as I explained on Jimmy Church's show, they didn't have a military-industrial complex. They were a military-industrial complex. In one way or another, every scientist, every teaching instructor, every educator, every student, everybody in one way or another was basically supporting a massive military superstructure. And they had nothing to offer the world on the market. They didn't make competitive cars. They didn't make competitive products. They had nothing to sell to the rest of the world. The only thing they had to offer the world was war. So because of that, everyone said, well, don't deal with them. They've got nothing to buy. All they've got is tanks that can invade your country and precious little else. Well, the end result was, of course, they collapsed. And because the Soviet Union totally collapsed, you have what you have today, a renaissance of free market in Russia, where they have far more of a capitalist system than you do in the United States. And because of that, we go back to the United States. What do they have to offer the world? Well, pretty much nothing other than war. Their music sucks. Their movies suck. Their education sucks. So basically, all they've got to offer the world is, well, we don't know what we can give you or sell you. You know, our American cars aren't worth a shit. Our products fall apart when you touch them, but we can bomb you. We can come by and send drones to attack and wipe out weddings and funerals and kill your kids. How about that? And everybody said, well, we don't want that. So we stopped dealing with the United States. So in the end, the same thing's going to happen to the United States as happened to the Soviet Union. And you're going to ask, how did this happen? We had such a big military. And it's exactly what happened in the Soviet Union. Everybody was standing in bread lines, hugging each other. Literally, there are photographs of this where you could see long lines where all the Russians were hugging each other. The reason they're hugging each other is not just because it's cold, but it was that too. It was to prevent anybody from cutting in line. So they hugged each other, prevented people from jumping the line, and then they would get their, collect their distributed bread, etc. I mean, that was life in the Soviet Union. That's what life's becoming in the United States. And of course, the Soviets all tolerated it because they said, well, we gotta do this because the Nazis invaded, and the Nazis invaded and they killed millions of us, and we can't have that happen again, so we gotta have the biggest military in the world. So they were the world's best defended third world nation. And what did that get them? Nothing. It got them nothing. The whole world fell apart. And so the United States, here you are today. Can you say you're the best defended third world nation on earth? No. You're not defended at all. Because if anyone wants to come in, you know it. They could walk in through Canada. They could walk in through Mexico. They could blow your cities apart. They could just blow apart your gas lines, your pipelines, prevent any energy from being distributed to your cities, and your cities would dry up and die. You'd have cannibalism within days. You've got a situation where your military is effing worthless. How can you have survived 9/11 and watched what was supposed to be a foreign attack on your domestic soil that your military was totally incapable of responding to, and say, we've got a functional military? Your military is worthless. You have no military defense. So you might as well say, get rid of the military, put all the money into education, senior care, health care, everything imaginable. And you would have a renaissance, and your life would improve. You could redistribute it all to buy homes for the homeless, to shoe the shoeless, to feed the hungry. You would be suddenly of a quality of life that would be comparable, or perhaps even rivaling, that of Japan, or Taiwan, or South Korea, or places where people actually live instead of just survive. You would say, my God, what happened? Why didn't we do this before? Well, the reason you didn't do it before was because you were living under a military junta of a bunch of lying senior citizen war criminals who told you atomic bombs won the effing war, and that you had to build more atomic bombs so that they could win every war. And then you never won a single war. You lost World War II to Japan. You lost World War III, in a sense, on the Korean Peninsula to the communists. You lost Vietnam. You lost everything. You were losing in Iraq. You're going to lose in Afghanistan. You're going to lose in Syria. And where's your effing bomb? So your bomb, you couldn't eat it. You couldn't use it to get to the moon. You couldn't use it to establish colonies on Mars. And now you're left with a military that is so dysfunctional that you've got to hire private mercenaries to replace it. And that brings us back, of course, to these marauding mercenary armies. Now, Blackwater, of course, was the most notorious example. Erik Prince, its founder and its sole owner for many, many years, was part of a family that figures among the major contributors to the Republican Party and other right-wing causes, such as the Council for National Policy. His sister once told the press, "My family is the largest contributor of soft money to the National Republican Party." Now, it attracted the critical attention of the American mainstream media for many years, had to change its name multiple times to prevent or escape multiple lawsuits. And as a result, many people began to think of it as the mercenary company. But it was simply a knight on the grand chessboard, albeit one with the ability to influence the moves of the game. but far less noticed, as shall we say, was a corporation by the name of Diligence Limited Liability Corporation. And Diligence is actually a more powerful company. And unlike Blackwater, it interfaces heavily with Wall Street. It set up shop in Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, in July of 2003 to provide security for companies involved in Iraqi reconstruction or exploitation. Now, it established a new subsidiary called Diligence Middle East and expanded its services to include screening, vetting, training of local hires, and the provision of daily intelligence briefs to its corporate clients. And its political clout actually outshone and outlasted Blackwater's. Two of the founding directors, one was Lanny Griffiths, another one was Ed Rogers. They were also the founders of the influential Republican lobbying team Barber Griffiths and Rogers, later renamed BGR. Now, Haley Barber, the senior founder of BGR, also served as the chairman of the Republican National Committee from 1993 to 1997 throughout the Presidio military base closure. That's how I came to know of them. Now, Diligence LLC was licensed to do business in Iraq as a private military contractor, but it is more properly referred to, because of its think tank branch, as a private intelligence contractor, or a PIC. It's virtually a CIA spin-off. It was founded by William Webster, the only man to head both the Central Intelligence Agency and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And Mike Baker was its chief executive officer. He spent about 14 years at the CIA as a covert field operations officer, specializing in counterterrorism and counterinsurgency operations. And I believe its chief operating officer in Baghdad was Whitley Brunner, who was once the CIA station chief in Iraq. Now, its partner in Diligence Middle East is Newbridge Strategies, and their purpose was described by the New York Times as a consulting firm to advise companies that want to do business in Iraq, including those seeking pieces of taxpayer-financed reconstruction projects. So its political clout was based on who got the fat, juicy contracts that would be a perfect opportunity for the laundering of money from the United States to offshore accounts. I think New York Times, or was it Wall Street Journal? It was the Financial Times of London, as a matter of fact, that first published some journalism about Newbridge when it was established. And it came to public attention because of all the Republican heavyweights that were on board. Most of them linked to one or the other Bush administration officials or to the Bush crime dynasty itself. And these included, if I remember, Joel Allball, George W. Bush's presidential campaign manager, and Ed Rogers and Lanny Griffith, former George H.W. Bush aides. Now, the firm of BGR, Barber Griffith and Rogers, was the initial funder of Diligence, and it shares an office floor with BGR and Newbridge in a building 4 blocks from the White House. Now, the Financial Times linked the success in securing contracts to their relationship to Neil Bush, the president's brother. And Mac McLarty, Clinton's White House chief of staff, he resigned and became a director of Diligence. And he also joined Henry Kissinger to head, until at least 2008, Kissinger McLartley Associates. And these are the people who basically run your world into the ground, war after war after war. By the way, somebody in text might ask me about the Kissinger deal. Kissinger McLarty is spelled Kissinger, and then McLarty is M-C-L-A-R-T-Y. Now, another private intelligence contractor is Science Applications International Corporation. They're an $8 billion corporation involved in defense, intelligence community, homeland security contracting, and they've displayed an uncanny ability to thrive in every conceivable political climate. Now, what is so important about this is that one of them, when he was interviewed in media, made no bones about it. He said, "We make American military doctrine." This is basically a situation in which they are essentially deciding who your military invades. the tail has truly come to wag the dog. We are in a situation now where, even though I have concentrated up to this point in my career exposing to yourself the occult aspects of our need for a state of nonstop and perpetual war, what I have neglected to expose to yourself is the more practical financial aspects of why people make so much money doing so. So we are in a state now, of course, where when people are beginning to ask, what do I do to get a job? Most people will find, if they're a male, if they are able-bodied, if they can handle a weapon, that one of their hopes for the future is to sell their soul and go around killing other people in foreign nations for a private company. So how do we stop this? We stop this by bringing them home to defend our city-states, since your military has proven entirely incompetent to do so. One of these corporations could provide a better team of SWAT personnel than your municipal constabulary. So we've gone beyond the Eisenhower nightmare in the foreign field with a military-industrial counterterrorism complex, and we need to bring it home. Now, it's important to remember that unlike your government, which is not a unified bureaucracy at all, corporations you might think have more of their act together. But they're not united either. They're just a platform for individual entrepreneurship in obtaining contracts. Now, SAIC, or that Strategic Applications International Corporation which I'm describing, basically, if you're part of that setup, your job is fundamentally to sell your high-tech ideas and blue-chip expertise to any government agency with the money to spend and an impulse to buy. This is why we've got to get all of our tax dollars out of the military. Because before becoming Secretary of Defense, Robert M. Gates was a member of Science Applications International Corporation, or SAIC's board of directors. SAIC personnel have also been recruited from the CIA, the NSA, and DARPA. So all your government is basically going privatized. You are now hiring out who runs your government. But what is your government? It was a military junta. So basically, you're hiring it out now to private mercenary corporations. Now, the reason this is so terrifying is because if you go back into the city-states period of the Condottieri, Machiavelli and his hatred of mercenaries came from the fact that mercenaries are by nature unreliable armies. They will fight for whoever pays them more. Some of them would turn against their native cities. And that is why Dante Alighieri portrayed Ferrata, who was an infamous mercenary who turned against his native city. He portrayed him as burning in hell within one of the Inferno's levels. In his case, I believe it was actually the level for heretics, because he turned against his city on the basis of a religious schism. Now, you have mercenaries, if we bring them back to the United States. Can you trust them to defend your city-states? Well, you don't really have a choice. You're going to pay for that defense, and you'll pay more than you would pay, shall I say, a rival city-state, or even a rival nation-state. But whatever you pay is going to be nothing compared to what you pay every year for the military junta that runs your empire to the ground today. Given a choice between out-and-out interface with brutal thugs who are demanding money, and with a U.S. government which takes that money anyway and spends it on these brutal thugs and sends them overseas to make you more enemies, they won't be at home to defend you when those enemies come home. You may as well bring them home, and they won't be making you enemies overseas, and you'll be paying them and having them fight each other. And that would be whenever conflicts of city-states occur, but nevertheless, such internecine warfare, fighting over maritime rights, fishing rights up and down the coast of the Atlantic Northeast or the Pacific Northwest, infinitely better situation than what you've got today with the enemies you're creating all over the world who are going to come back and blow your ass away at some point using genuine nukes, using biological warfare, electromagnetic pulse, scalar weapons, and basically turn your life into a living hell, which no one can recover you from. Far better, get rid of the military, bring these boys home, start your nation-state system, and experience an economic and cultural renaissance. And that is kind of the choice we're left with on the basis of the horrible situation your war criminals of the Second World War placed you into when they said atomic bombs won us the war and we've got to build more and more and more, and all your scientists and physicists have to learn how to make nuclear bombs, and all of your biologists have to go into designing biological weapons, and your entire business or industry of science was perverted into military contracting. Now, at least these mercenary companies won't be interested in research and development. You're not going to have mercenary companies like Cobra in the comic books creating research and development laboratories. They couldn't care less. And as a result, your scientists, your educators, all of your technicians will be freed up to deal with maintaining your hospitals, training new engineers, giving you an environment in which you can actually have a civilian space program. So that's why we've got to work with what I would call the necessary evil. Having been a mercenary myself, I can give you basically the skinny that this is the safe, reliable way to go. You get what you pay for. Whereas with the military, because they collect your money no matter what, you don't get what you pay for. You're paying out of the ass. And you're paying again when they F you up the ass. So you gotta say, do I want to continue getting it up the ass and paying for it? Or you say, I'm gonna pay another gigolo and I get to give it to him in the ass. That's basically the choice you've got. So this is where we've come to. Already, the Science Administration Science Applications and International Corporation, SAIC, it was their personnel that were instrumental in pressing the case that weapons of mass destruction existed in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, and that war was the only way to get rid of them. When no weapons of mass destruction were found, SAIC personnel staffed the commission to set up to investigate how American intelligence could have been so disastrously wrong. So they promoted the false story, then they investigated how the false story got started. And they basically came to a conclusion, of course, with a revolving door of investigations, that nobody was responsible. And as a result, you've got people who are starting your wars that have nothing to do with your legitimately elected government. And unless you draw them home and break up the corporations, divest, make them into private mercenary armies for your city-states, they're going to continue dragging your empire into a state of constant war that is going to damn your population to the ultimate enmity of everybody on Earth. So we have a situation where we've got, say, for instance, 9/11, where it was a personal tragedy for thousands of families, but served the best interests of private intelligence and military contractors, because in the aftermath of the attacks, the Bush administration launched its global war on terror. And its chief consequence has been to channel money by the tens of billions into companies promising they could do something, anything. And SAIC was ready, along with Blackwater and so many other companies. But it was SAIC that was able to do it without getting blamed. And again, I want people to look it up, Science Applications International Corporation. So we've got a kind of like a Pinkertons or a private detective agency that kills people for hire. And one of the things that has given them an enormous amount of power has been the passage of the Patriot Act. It generated a new realm of profit for state contractors, domestic surveillance of United States citizens, as well as new intelligence fusion centers to carry it out with. So we've got this situation where private firms not only provide, but also analyze intelligence. Private translators, analysts, even interrogators or torturers are hired. And this is proven by the involvement of CACI, CACI. I'll have my secretarial assistant look up that acronym because I forget what it is consciously. But they were involved with Abu Ghraib and the prison scandal. And people kept thinking it was National Guard, the involvement of the U.S. military. It was all actually done through a private corporation. Two of them, as a matter of fact, Titan as well as CACI. Now, we've got a situation, of course, where we are going to have to ask ourselves, with all of this going on, what does your military do? Why would you need it? If it's come to this point, how could anyone say, in their right mind, that without a military, you would not be on air, say, for instance, on Jimmy Church's piece of shit show with 0 ratings and a bunch of retarded kids basically tweeting in to say how much they hate people of other races who aren't white. You get this situation where they say, oh, we need a military to defend ourselves. Well, they're inherently stupid people, so they would think something that stupid. But the reality is, your military is giving its intelligence gathering, its reconnaissance, its analysis, and even its torture and interrogation over to private corporations. So war has now become literally a business. It is no longer the business of nation states under the umbrella of the American empire. And as a result, you have a situation where you're going to have to confront this and say, how do I get a job in this environment if I'm not a torturer, a intelligence analyst, a man who's going to carry a gun? What is it that I'm going to do to get myself a living in this new environment? Well, you're going to have to confront the fact that you're not going to get a job, because how long can this last? How long can this honestly last when I gave you the preeminent precursor, the prescient example of the Soviet Union? Nobody dealt with the Soviet Union. The ruble was tissue paper soft. It was fit for wiping your ass as any piece of toilet paper. What would you get with a ruble? The Soviet Union's administrators, the bureaucrats, the diplomats would go from nation state to nation state and say, hey, I've got rubles. We can pay you to help with reconstructing your economy. And of course, you know, people would respond in places such as Ethiopia or Mongolia or Nicaragua, and they'd say, well, I got me a bag of rabbit shit, and this rabbit shit can grow me plants. What can your ruble do? Well, nothing. It can't grow you plants. We can't do nothing with the ruble. Well then, thanks, I don't need you. Well, that's basically what we say about the American dollar, because you people go all over the world and say, well, we can't sell you anything, but we can bring mercenaries here to rape your kids, and we can drone strike your weddings and funerals. So how much longer is this going to last, where you can actually even establish yourself professionally in a global war economy that's not even run with military surveillance, supervision, or even input, or participation, or interaction? You are at a point now where you've got nothing going for you other than war without even a military to be involved in it. So the end result is, why are you maintaining a military? Well, at this point, I think you get what I'm saying. So, with that in mind, I do want to bring up something that Laura Lee Solomon brought up about the new Pinkertons. I'm going to have her look up that company for me, if indeed there was a company. But apparently, there have been unidentified paramilitary squads of men that have been descending onto marijuana fields and destroying them. They're descending from the sky in helicopters, kind of like a miniature Apocalypse Now. They're dressed in camouflage, various BVDs that are various. Was it BVD or BMD? I'm confusing probably the camouflage suit with the underwear. It's been so many years since I've worn one. But at any rate, they're descending out of helicopters with their face masks, with their sunglasses, with their skewed hats, and they destroy marijuana crop fields. And no one knows who's hiring them. No one knows where they're getting their equipment from. But let's face practical facts. There is no vigilantism involved. Now, the term vigilantism has been used in regards to these mysterious private goon squads, or armies. And vigilantism, of course, involves... here we are. Thank you, dear lady. She, of course, brings up the fact that they are not hiding Paul Truette. Now, his family name, his surname is spelled Trouette. He is with Lear Asset Management. So these are apparently involved with Lear. Whether they're relatives of John Lear or his family or not, I do not know. But Lear Asset Management's 55-year-old founder spoke with TPM, which I'm going to assume is just some information venue, for over 30 minutes earlier this week to describe what his company does and why they do it. They see themselves as filling a void that law enforcement cannot. Truett at one point involved the Pinkertons, the private detective agency notorious for, among other things, violently busting unions and chasing Wild West outlaws, to demonstrate the historical precedent for what they're now doing in this country of 88,000 on this county of 88,000, on the edge of the California redwoods. Now, we have multiple counties in the western states that are larger than states on the East Coast. Now, TPM is Talking Points Memo. It's a blog site. Thank you for clarifying that, dear lady. And in terms of all of this, the term vigilantism was, of course, still used, but their personnel, dear lady, are indeed hiding their identities. Their personnel are indeed wearing face masks. Their personnel are indeed covering their faces. And they're not really, shall I say, presenting themselves in terms of who is ultimately paying for this. Now, she brings up the fact as well, law enforcement just doesn't have the means to take care of it any longer, according to Paul Truett, again, Lear Asset Management's 55-year-old founder. Now, he told TPM, or Talking Points Memo, the blog site, that the 2011 murder of Fort Bragg, California city councilman Jerry Mello by an illegal trespasser tending poppy plants as Mello patrolled private land for a timber company made a big impression on him, and he incorporated the same year, and the company has since worked with a nonprofit founded in Mello's memory. That's when the hole began to be filled in my understanding of how to put together a cohesive, legal, organized private security firm that is now dealing with these types of issues, Truett was saying. In terms of what's going on with Truett, he sees Lear as the cutting edge of citizens becoming involved in their communities and utilizing their legal rights to affect positive change in the communities. Now, this is just shit. I mean, that's like, that would be, that's like somebody in charge of Blackwater saying, we're uniters, not dividers. Everybody hates us wherever we go. It's something like that. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, how is the rest of the community involved with this? They're not involved with this at all. They're not fueling the helicopters. They're not giving these guys lunches, Anyhow, Truett described his relationship with the county sheriff as strained. Now, isn't that interesting? Now that, by the way, shows you something is up. Now, in a phone interview, Mendocino County Sheriff Tom Allman seemed a little uncomfortable with having armed contractors operating in his jurisdiction. No shit. He said he hadn't given any evidence that Lear infringed on marijuana growers' rights, though he would be quick to investigate if he was. Truett asserted his team had only ever conducted marijuana raids on private land where they'd been hired to work. He said, I will go out of my way to investigate anybody who's doing vigilante work in the name of trying to make the world a better place. This is the sheriff, of course, saying he would go out of his way to do this. He says, but he can't open an investigation until somebody says they're the victim of a crime. Now, this kind of conduct has its own serious risks. Sheriff Ullman was adamant he didn't want to be seen as criticizing Truett. Not going to say anything negative about his business. Now, that's interesting. Why would he care about criticizing somebody with a private corporation unless he's afraid of who is ultimately employing this individual? And it has to be government or something worse. The medical industrial complex, the pharmaceuticals industry. Almost certainly they are employing Truett to sabotage private marijuana growth and personal marijuana industry. Now, the sheriff said that he supports the property rights of private landowners who want to hire a company like Lear, but then he described his greatest fear knowing that a firm like Truett's is working in the same area as his own officers. His greatest fear, of course, being friendly fire, quote unquote. Nothing friendly about it. Now, let me tell you what keeps me awake. This is Ullman again. If a citizen calls up and says, listen, there's men with long guns and camouflage green that look like policemen that are cutting my marijuana down, and my dispatcher says, oh my God, it's not us. And then he says, what are we going to do? We're going to send cops with guns to the location where we think there's a marijuana ripoff. Honestly, what could possibly go wrong here? A lot more things are going to go wrong than are going to go right. And he's absolutely correct. And at some point, as my secretarial assistant and producer Laura Lee Solomon has said, what happens when some little old lady, Brownie Mary, you know, whatever local California version of Brownie Mary, Brownie Mary, by the way, was a San Francisco lady who used to make marijuana brownies to give to AIDS patients. And she did this for 20 years. And none of the police would ever dare to touch her because nobody wanted to be known as the asshole who arrested Brownie Mary. So everybody just pretty much let her alone. And I personally met her. I personally met and spoke with her. I mean, not for a very long time because we have nothing to talk about together. She's in a totally different world from a totally different paradigm than I operate in. But she basically, what if the equivalent of her in terms of green-fingered old granny is suddenly going to pull out a shotgun and take one of these yokels down who lands in a helicopter and tries to pull an apocalypse down on her private little marijuana patch. Now, apparently there's a Lear brochure which is going around in which the company brags that it works with state and federal law enforcement agencies like the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and the Bureau of Land Management, the same people who, of course, have had Bundy under siege for 20 years now, as well as the U.S. Forest Service. Now, according to Lear, the private security boys, they don't have any contracts with the company, or they claim they work with it, but the DEA, the BLM, and the U.S. Forest Service told Talking Points, a memo, that actually this isn't true, that they don't have any contracts with Lear Company. So the California Department of Fish and Wildlife said that a $78,000 grant that they awarded to a nonprofit of which Truett is a member, the Mendocino County Blacktail Association, was used to hire Lear for environmental cleanup. Now, what the hell has that got to do with marijuana trimming? So that's so we've got a very mysterious situation as to who their employers are, which brings me back to the pharmaceuticals as the primary suspect. But this is not vigilantism. This is mercenary work. This is warlordism. This is basically private corporations, robber barons at work. Okay, join us on Saturday Night Firing Lines, and we'll go over many more topics.